what we're going to talk about today, some of you might be kind of aware that traditionally people have always presumed that autism was very much a male thing, and that more recently people have talked about this idea of a female presentation of autism, which has led to many more autistic females being diagnosed. Traditionally, people thought there were, in the bit of autism that you inhabit, i.e. that you don't have an intellectual learning disability, people thought there were 9 times as many men as there were women with Asperger's syndrome, this bit of autism. More recently, we're down to about 2 to 1 male to female. So the ratio has just changed enormously because people have started to realise that not everybody presents and experiences their autism in this very traditional way. The reason that all of this happened is that because the kind of modern day pioneers of autism were 2 people. One was called Asperger and one was called Kanner. They were both talking about autism in the 1940s. They both studied boys only. They both thought autism was very rare, and from their initial work, we have developed absolutely everything that we know about autism. So when I did all of my training in autism, even 10, 12, 15 years ago, it was all about boys and it was all about males. And if you begin by finding boys, you will continue to find boys because the list of criteria that you're looking for is male, and surprise, surprise, it picks up more males than it does females. And that's been going on since the 1940s. So for sort of 60, 70 years or so, we've just perpetuated this whole thing. So because if you keep finding boys and then you try and do some research and you look for girls, there aren't any because you never found any. And so the research is covered in boys again. And so the next time you do some research, you can't find any girls. And then on we go going, there are no girls. Oh no, there are no girls. Look, there are no girls. And we end up kind of perpetuating that. So over the last sort of 10 years or so, people have started to realise that actually there are many girls, maybe as many females as there are males on the autistic spectrum, but that some of those individuals present their autism in a slightly different way, still meet all the criteria exactly, but present it in a way that people didn't realise.
Here's another sensory question. Hello, Craig and Dr. Tony. I have developed a bad fear of fireworks and any loud or sudden noises, in particular in the evening or nighttime. It's become so bad that I naturally get nervous once it starts to get darker. Is there anything I can do other than wear earmuffs? How do I rewire this fear out of me? And it's signed Aspie Teen.
Okay. Well, what we're focusing on here is sudden, sharp noises, fireworks, dogs barking. In fact, what you can get in autism is the auditory sensitivity of a dog, and dogs don't like fireworks and become very upset by them, very distressed. It also means that in psychological terms, you're developing classical conditioning, as in Pavlov's dogs salivating to the sound of the bell that means a meal is on its way. That is, as soon as it gets dark, you will remember the bad experiences, almost the trauma, because it's painful, of the fireworks. The two are now linked. Getting dark means a risk of fireworks, so your anxiety will increase. Now, from my clinical experience, and yesterday I read a research article which confirms sometimes research is about 10 to 20 years behind clinical experience. But anyway, that showed that repeated exposure to sensory experiences that are aversive in autism does not reduce the reaction. For neurotypicals, eventually the brain says, that's not as bad as you thought, tone it down, it's not important, leave it be. But the startle reaction continues in autism throughout life. My sister-in-law has a fear of dogs barking, and it's the sharp noise. And she said, Tony, I'm now in my 60s. It began when I was 3 years old. It has not diminished through 50-odd years from repeated exposure to dogs barking. What changes is I now avoid dogs wherever I can, walk away from them if they're in the street, but also for the sake of a family gathering, etc., I will endure it but I've only been able to do that with maturity. So I think the only suggestions of this are, as the person suggests, a barrier, earmuffs, avoidance of firework displays, etc. Maybe a sensory blocker, listening to music. It's interesting that I have had one or two individuals, and I would love people to just check this out if they could, who have used the services of a hypnotherapist that specializes in pain, as in childbirth or dentistry. And whether you can find somebody who uses hypnosis for pain, and I would see the sensory sensitivity as a pain reaction, if that can significantly reduce the response. So it's mainly trying to control your reaction if you can, but that requires being incredibly brave, and other people really need to appreciate this is hell for you.
There are people that have, rather than having very late first encounters, there are people that have very early first encounters, and often that's because they're very vulnerable. If you can't read people, if people say they want to be with you, if people say they love you, if people say that they're going to be your friend, then there's a real naivety and a gullibility in autistic people, and we just believe people. We're literal, we take people at face value, we don't see hidden agendas. It's all in the diagnostic criteria, and that means that a lot of us have had lots of quite predatory, quite dangerous, quite abusive encounters because we didn't see it coming.
I absolutely agree. I didn't see it coming. Really not. So what happened? I was actually happy at work. I was working in a hospital-like facility. And I was good at it. I liked to do this work, and those were people that were really severely disabled, and we just had to look after them, wash them in the morning, take them out of bed, and certain people had to be fed. Yeah, and I was already about 2 or 3 years doing this job, and we had a nice team of nurses, and even as a autistic, I felt accepted. It was okay. I was shy, but everybody was nice, and it just worked out for me. The first time in my life, I was rather in a very good place. I started to do some classes, what interested me in natural healing, massage and stuff like that. I had 2 clients already that came to massage, and I was also doing the mandalas and even sold a few mandalas. So it was really a good place from where I was at this time. But then, yeah, there was a new worker that came, and the head nurse told me, "You have to show her around. You are good at this, and you can show her around." And I didn't feel I was up to it, and I didn't like this new worker. I didn't like her, really not. There was this first impression, and usually it is right. Listen to that. And I told the head nurse, cannot anybody do it? I don't want to do it. And this was also my autistic self coming through. Yeah, and she told me, you have to do it. And that's how trouble started. And yeah, so this new worker creeped into my life, and at some point I just trusted her. But what she did, what a narcissist normally does, she just mimicked me. She faked the same interests, like dolphins and, traveling. We liked both traveling. That was what we had in common, but she faked the same interests, so she would pull me in. And then she told me a sob story, and that was it. I felt compassion, and I trusted that she told the truth. Yeah, and then I caved in. That was my undoing. And I'm actually asexual. And I didn't know that at the time. I was so naive in everything. I was inexperienced. And I had tried it with men and nothing happened, even though my dad said, this is so great. Sexual intercourse is something you need in life. And he was just a normal guy in this, right? But I wasn't. I am autistic and asexual too. But I didn't know that, so I thought, maybe I am gay. Okay, so let's try it out. That was my naive thinking, and oh gosh, it was so bad. And it ended up in physical abuse, because at some point I felt so nauseous, and I said, I cannot do that. Let's just have a platonic friendship relationship without the sexual part. And then from then on it went downhill. And physical violence started. It was stuff like strangling, or hitting me in the face, or kicking me. Oh, I just remembered something. I have a sensitivity in my left hip. Possibly there is some trauma residing in this place, because that's where my ex actually kicked me. Okay, I might have to work with that. Anyway, I digress. So, so kicking, and then one time I gave her a rose, what you do in a relationship, right? And she then just emptied the dirty water from this rose over my head and kicked the rose around on the floor, because she was mad about some inferior shit I had done. And there were tiny triggers that set her off. And we were loud, and the neighbors came and said, should we call the police? And that physical violence, it wasn't, so bad that I had to go to a hospital. It wasn't that bad. But one time she scratched me and it bled. I thought she would take my hand in a restaurant, in a public place, right? She didn't. She scratched me in a split second. It was, and a mean expression on her face. You could so see that hate, or whatever that was, or just a pleasure to give pain to somebody else, or surprise them with a mean action. Narcissists, they thrive on that, inflicting pain. So there were all those incidences, and I was all alone in it because I felt ashamed. I thought it was my mistake, you know? That's what you do. And of course, a narcissist will gaslight you and give you the impression it's all you, it's not them. And to the point when you really question your sanity. So I was at a very vulnerable point, and my dad once really witnessed this encounter when we came home from skiing, and we were in a traffic jam and we were late, and my ex, she completely lost it in front of my dad, and he was like, what the hell is that, what she's doing to you, and this is not okay, and I will take you home. So he basically kidnapped me out of this toxic relationship. He saved me in this way. But then I was back at my parents' place, right? I was taken from one toxic place to another toxic place, basically. But it was a good thing to get out of this toxic relationship. I don't know what I had done if my dad didn't save me. So that was over, but then I was in a very vulnerable place. I kept working at this hospital facility, but I had to change to another team of nurses because my ex kept bothering me. When you work with your ex, it's horrible, and you can never recover. And she was a stalker. She just came after me, she kept calling me and stuff like that. So I had to change to another team of nurses with other patients. So I lost my environment, which is actually not a good thing for an autistic. And I was depressed, and I was in a very vulnerable state, and that's where I was open to anything. Yeah, and that's how I fell into the clutches of a cult. They offered free meditation classes, and I wanted to learn something that gave me strength and independence and agency and finding myself after everything. Yeah, you just don't make the best decision when you are in a vulnerable place, especially when you don't have support from anybody, really. I was very isolated. That's another thing narcissists do. They isolate you, so you cannot ask anybody for help, really. Yeah, and that's how I then moved to another city because they offered me a job as well as a place to live. And I was that naive. I thought, oh, those are good people, they are nice to me, which is actually the love bombing in another form, and they are trained in this. They know how to do this love bombing and fish people. So I fell for it, and that's how I ended up being in a cult for over 10 years. And if you had developmental trauma, toxic stress during childhood, so my dad, for example, was a functional alcoholic, and then my parents were fighting all the time, and already the noise they made, it was so loud, and disharmony that was highly stressful in itself, plus my dad always criticizing me, invalidating me, gaslighting me, and he meant well to a certain degree. However, he was traumatized himself because of the Soviet trauma. Let's say it like that. He had experienced a totalitarian regime, and he fled, fearing for his life and fearing that his parents and his sister might be harmed because of him, and that he might never see them again, and also the fear of prosecution if he got caught, and all of that. And I don't think he ever really was able to heal this kind of trauma, and also the paranoia, and then you have the alcohol that also didn't help really. So all of that, I had a big influence through my dad, and because he had a certain degree of paranoia, he was very controlling, and he didn't let me do things I should have learned during childhood, and that would have helped me. I mean, just riding horses, and I was helping out in a stable where they had many horses, and all of the girls were allowed to go on a ride in the evening in a group. It was safe. But my dad, he said, you have to be at home at this time. And he was very weird about that. So already through that, I was the one standing out. Yeah, so later on, I was looking after a horse in a different place where they had just 2 horses, and that was more doable and uncomplicated. But still, my dad always blocked me from doing things, so he could have taught me how to drive a car. He was a very good driver. He didn't. And he had very little patience, and he started screaming and criticizing, which didn't help. All of that. And then the big trauma at age 13 when my dad hit my mother. That was me basically every evening crying myself to sleep while my parents were being very loud, fighting, arguing about who knows what. And yeah, they probably had too much wine, which loosens the tongue. And I must say, my mother she wasn't innocent in this. She could nag quite well. And my dad, he had a temper and he would lose it like in a split second. He was very quick to jump into a fit of rage. And then you would not know what he could do. So, yeah, that happened. And then probably my mother nagged him too much, and then he just lost it and hit her. And with PTSD, that's just how it is. You can lose your control and do things that you later regret. And that was the ultimate trauma, because something just broke in me, and it was also the beginning of puberty, so everything just came together, and from that point on I was depressed and passively suicidal all through puberty, and if not for the horses, I don't know what I would have done. Horses pulled me through, not people. And I didn't get any support at school. They all thought that I was, I don't know, shy and not motivated and not interested and a dreamer and whatnot. But never ever has somebody really asked me what's going on. They just didn't do it. There was no real effort to get into it. So school in itself was also kind of traumatic, because they didn't really support me, and I felt that kind of criticism on top of everything. Yeah, so all of that, of course, was early trauma, and it could have been different if I had enough support and somebody at least who had my back. So I had selective mutism and I was shy as well, and therefore I couldn't really ask for help. It was really difficult, and yeah, so I don't know. That's just how it went, and that's why from quite early on I was on this path to basically self-sabotage and not really making the proper decisions, and bumping into people who also would exploit me and lie to me. And that's how I ended up in this abusive relationship. And then later on I ended up in a cult and lost basically about 15 years of time that could have been spent in a better way, like studying or really educating myself in the topics that interest me, learning how to drive, and building a good foundation. And I mean, 15 years is a long time to lose yourself. Yeah. So, what can I do?
And it's nothing to do with intelligence. It's nothing to do with being clever or able. It's being able to read people and their agendas is a completely different part of the brain, a completely different skill. So again, we end up with a profile of people who may well have had lots of relationships, who may be seeking relationships, who may be putting themselves in these dangerous situations. And traditionally, we never thought that looked like autism, but it does. Because you can't read people, because you get it wrong, because you make poor decisions about partners and relationships, because you struggle to see that other person's perspective. It's not the case that autistic people don't have empathy. It is the case that autistic people don't have neurotypical empathy. And neurotypical people, they don't have autistic empathy. They just have neurotypical empathy. There is a huge amount of empathy within autistic people, and I've seen that in this room so many times. If somebody shares something that the rest of you just go, oh God, yes. Even if you've not had that absolute experience, you get it, don't you? You know what it's like to feel awkward. You know what it's like to feel overwhelmed. You know what it's like to feel uncomfortable in a way that neurotypical people won't. They know what it's like between themselves, but this is a different experience, isn't it? It's a different experience that you have. So the empathy is there within your own culture, within your own social group, within your own network. I think the issue is cross, and this is something that Luke Bearden, who comes here sometimes, talks about, that cross-phenotype empathy doesn't exist. It's the same way that we can't empathise with gay people if we're straight. We can't empathise with black people if we're white. We can't empathise with people with very deep religious beliefs if we don't have any. We just can't, because we can't put ourselves in that person's place.
So I agree to that in regards to not being able to ever know how it is to have a physical disability, like being in a wheelchair, visually impaired, or not able to hear. However, I can definitely relate to the part of feeling discriminated or invalidated, not understood, and all of that. And I have exercise intolerance, which of course is not the same. I'm still able to walk and see where I'm going and all of that, but I mean it in a way that people don't see what I'm struggling with. They don't see the migraines or the exhaustion. So I can relate to when somebody tells me he or she struggle with that too, fibromyalgia, for example, or migraines. I know how that feels like, so I can relate to that part. And I know how it feels like when you have a limited amount of spoons, where other people have so much energy and they can do whatever they want all day long, and I have to be careful to not feel exhausted when I do too much. So I will always be able to have empathy for that part. Or, for example, there was the thing during the lockdown when in shopping centers they just blocked all the disability parking places. So those people in wheelchairs, they had a more difficult access. So that was discrimination, and I still can relate to that. It's frustrating. It's irritating, and you cannot believe how people can be so inconsiderate that during a lockdown, suddenly disability is crossed off the table and you are even more pushed into a corner and disabled by the environment. So that part I can relate to. And I agree what Sarah Hendricks says, that still, if you are not yourself in this situation, you will not be able to completely understand what it feels like. That part is definitely true. But then I also have observed within the autistic community some divide and very little empathy when you don't fit there. So you have to fulfill a certain political agenda. You have to be against ABA, for example, and you have to be pro-vaccine, which I find weird. So it's kind of political, and if you don't fit into that, you are basically cast out, excommunicated within the autism community. But then again, there are the nice autistics, and within that community, it's really nice to be able to understand each other in our struggle to cope with the environment. So there are two sides, and I see that with neurotypicals as well. There are two sides. Some, they have a very cold clinical approach. Some have an uneducated approach, so their ignorance just prevents them from understanding anything at all. And they normally do have empathy for other people, but if they don't understand you, they just can't have this empathy. And then there are those neurotypicals that are so warm-hearted and understanding. And it's such a blessing to talk to them. And it's mutual. You feel so safe and seen just the way you are, regardless of autism or not. And they are like that with everybody. They just accept people in general and have empathy, or at least interest, and try to learn about the other person so they can understand. So it's not just one thing or the other. I think it's a spectrum within the autism community, and then it's a spectrum within the neurotypical community, and also other cultures. And there are people who have empathy, and there are people who don't have empathy. I think even across cultures you can have still empathy if you know a lot about the other culture, meaning people like Tony Attwood and some other therapists or autism coaches that I have met personally, they are very empathic, and they also have really worked or lived or both with autistics, and therefore their understanding of autism differs very much from the understanding of somebody who has no idea about autism. So maybe it's more about a lack of context. If you don't have any context, then how would you know about something? For example, when a piece of art looks like garbage, somebody who does not know that this is a piece of art will mistake that for garbage and throw it away. So this really happened. I read that in a book. I think the level of empathy also differs from person to person, and what I have observed in people, it depends. When a person is down to earth and balanced in a yin-yang state of mind, meaning not just totally left hemisphere dominant. What I mean by that is certain clinicians that are trained in theory and perhaps just judge you from what the DSM-5 says and lack practice, or it is a certain type of mindset. It's almost like being brainwashed, and then they don't see the individual sitting in front of them, but just the diagnosis or the behavior, or I don't know what exactly it is, but they don't see you as individual, and you can't get through to them. It's almost like cult members. That's the same type of vibe you come across. And whatever you say, it doesn't matter. They just don't hear it. It's some type of cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias and narrow-minded thinking, black and white. No, that sounds very much like an autistic, but I mean this in general. I have seen this in non-autistics. And I think it's their training and lack of being around autistics at the daily level and really see the differences between people and not just judge from what they have learned about autism. So it's just a clinical approach which somehow loses the human aspect of it all. I don't know how else to explain that. But then, because of that, you can also call it perhaps medical arrogance and medical gaslighting. Then you lose empathy. There is no empathy, and there is no real interest in you as a person. They just see the diagnosis, and that's where empathy goes out the window. It's this cold measuring stick they use, and they use only one side to look at things. They don't see the whole picture. And for me, this approach has really a lot of issues. I got my diagnosis, okay, but there were a lot of things that really triggered me. So, a good therapist should have a balanced approach, be down to earth, interested, present, and they have to work on their own nervous system regulation. So they don't come across as cold and robot-like, aloof, but rather balanced and present, plus knowledgeable about the topic. All this combined, if they have the capacity to connect the dots, I would say the chance is bigger that they will show enough interest in a person who displays a different set of behavior. There will be curiosity, there will be openness, there will be compassion. If those things are present, you can at least try and understand somebody who has very different whatever behavior or a perspective, but if there is a kind of refusal to even look at it, or cognitive dissonance, this also can be in the way of really wanting to understand. So I see this everywhere when people are so set in their personal views of certain things and do not want to learn anything from the other side, regardless of the topic, then they just will not do it. And if there is willingness and openness to understand and not judge, there is a chance that they can meet in the middle and learn from each other.
You look too social, you look too that you want to be around people. It doesn't look like autism, but it is. So you can have all of these stuff on the other side, on the right-hand side, and still be autistic. The issue is that often these things go wrong because you can't read people, you can't work these kind of bits and pieces out. So we always used to think it was all Rain Man, Sheldon, nerds, loners, people didn't want any friends, no imagination, no creativity. That's what autism looked like. There were people who sat in corners, who were quite superior, who were quite arrogant, who were quite withdrawn, quite a negative view of autism. Now we've recognised this idea, which people are talking about as a female profile of autism, but actually that's slightly incorrect, because autism, the way that people exhibit their autism is not gender specific entirely. There will be males who present their autism in slightly different ways, and there will be females who are much more similar to our Rain Man, Sheldon traditional kind of profile. So what I wanted to talk about was all of the possible ways that you can meet the criteria for autism regardless of gender. So I don't want to talk about male autism or female autism. I'm going to talk about 0 autism and 1 autism, as in a nice binary a kind of process. So in order to get your diagnosis of autism, because I'm sure there might be some of you who sit there and think, well, I can't be autistic because I don't do that, or I can't be autistic because I do that. And how does that fit? Because we're all taught such a stereotypical view of what autism is. And if you don't meet it, or people in your lives don't meet it, you just go, well, that's not right, I can't have this. I'm sure, has anybody here shared or disclosed their autism and immediately been met with, don't be so silly, you can't be autistic, you don't look autistic? Yeah, quite a few people. And that's about other people assuming that, Rain Man, that you're Sheldon, that you can't be autistic. What kind of things do people say? You can't be autistic because what? What do they say? Has anyone said anything like that?
It's happened with me with a couple of quite close friends.
Yeah.
And I think partly they're frightened to accept that I'm different.
Right, yes. A standard general population person. Yeah. So you think that they're saying you can't be autistic because it just challenges their belief?
Yeah, and they will.
That who they see is someone else inside? That you're putting on I don't know.
They don't even think that.
They don't even go that far. It just challenges them. Okay. Did everyone hear that? Now you know what's wrong with you. Do you think you'll find it easier to fit in with everybody? No. Yeah. Anybody else had that challenge? You can't be autistic? Yeah. What have you?
Sorry, go first. I was just going to say I have.
Yeah.
But again, it was with friends who've known me not all my life, but decades, who just said, no, you're just you. And it's like, well, that is true, but that doesn't negate the fact that I have autism.
Yes.
They don't appreciate the difficulties that I have, but I can point out that, you know how you used to invite me to things? You stopped doing that a long time ago because I kept saying no. Yeah. So that's how it sort of...
Yeah, and I think people don't make those connections about all of that kind of stuff. And I think there's also a lot of people don't want a label, and they don't want to give you a label, even though I think a lot of us, we're really happy with the label, and the label has been a real explanation and a real but people are going, we don't need to label you, and I think some of us are going, no, please do label me. I'd like you to know that this defines me in some way. I think often it's the social side where you meet people for the first time, or people that you've known for a long time that just really struggle, as you said, to sort of feel that they have to shift their perception of you in some way. There's a speaker on the sort of autism circuit called Blackburn, and she's a very, very bright, intelligent woman, but she needs 24-hour care. If she stood up here, she would just look like me, perfectly able, perfectly capable, very, very articulate. She needs a carer. She can't travel anywhere by herself, and she says, my greatest disability is my ability. Being articulate, being verbal just seems to fool people enormously that there may be some other stuff kind of going on.
Thank you. Hello.
Roz, it's great to meet you finally. I've learned so much about you and heard so many wonderful stories from Barry and so many others. It's nice to finally meet you.
Although we are meeting virtually, yes, it's much easier for me actually. I have to go through all the sort of social paraphernalia of making sure that you remember to shake the hand, or whether you do or don't make eye contact, and whether you get the nods and the shakes of your head in the right order, or whether you kind of get it quite right. So it's much easier actually on the screen.
I totally agree. And if I'm getting it wrong, I can just turn off my video.
Absolutely.
That's true. It's very, very true. So, Roz, would you mind if I kind of toss out a few things that you've said, or I've heard you say, or that you've said to me, and that I've learned so much from, and then just go with it in terms of, helping our listeners?
Yeah, actually, fine. I think perhaps I ought to put out a comment, though, that it's a bit strange sort of doing this, representing a person with autism, because at the moment I just don't feel autistic. And in fact, I almost don't think I am autistic, because I've been completely on my own with the isolation due to COVID and the lockdown. And I thought, if you're not interacting with anybody, you can't actually have a social interaction impairment. And you cannot be autistic on your own. So I'm just me doing what I do. And it's only when someone comes in and sees that and then decides, oh, that's really autistic, that it gets sort of labelled that. But when you're on your own, you can't. It's been really quite good. So I'm not actually quite sure whether I'm qualified at the moment for the next few, I don't know how much longer this is going to go on for, but for the duration of this sort of isolation with COVID, whether I'm actually qualified to talk as a person with autism or not. But it's certainly, I think it's been quite interesting, the whole issue of COVID over the last year or so, because a lot of the distresses that other people have had haven't been issues for me, and yet I've had anxieties in other areas. So it's been quite an interesting one. And listening to non-autism people talk about their woes of COVID, it's been very contrasting actually to mine. So okay, but anyway, I thought I'd better put out that disclaimer. I thought if you're going to try and ask me as an autistic, then I thought, oh yikes, am I at the moment?
Okay, so I'm asking questions of the neurotypical version of Roz Blackburn here.
Yes, it's good. I like that perspective. Actually, it does feel at times like my autism tends to flare up when other people are around, but when it's just me.
So I like that. Yes, I know. So I suppose it's quite often described as a social and communication disorder. And so if you're not doing social because you're not allowed, how great is that? The rule is you mustn't socialise. I thought myself, never ever thought I'd hear that in my lifetime. There we are. But on that note, actually, I'm very keen, rather than calling it a social communication disorder, so I don't want to try and pretend to rewrite the textbooks or anything, but I see it much more as a social instinct issue rather than just simply a social issue. I think it's the social instinct, that bit you're born with, perhaps in me is just perhaps not there. Certainly, I think it's perhaps, in my case, void. Perhaps in other people on the spectrum, I don't know, I can't speak for them, obviously, but perhaps it might be a slight disruption in the social instinct, whereas for me, I just feel there's a void in social instinct. So I've had to learn pretty much sort of academically the things that I guess non-autism people just get, they're just born with it. It's just there. Whereas I've had to learn that and then rehearse it and, or be trained in it if I can't learn it for myself, and then try and put it into practice.
Roz, and that gets to an important point, because you say there's no such thing as autistic behavior, and if you're talking about a social instinct disorder, it's not something that people can observe, but they observe the results of it.
I would still maintain there is no such thing as autistic behaviour. I think there's nothing that I do or that we do. I'm really nervous about talking to others. I can only give you my individual sort of perspective and account, and I am a bit naughty that I generalise quite often, but it's my individual opinion, I should say. But I think there's nothing that people with autism do that other people without autism, wouldn't do. If they were provoked enough, if they were frightened enough, out of control enough, excited enough, overexcited enough, I think we all share behaviour because we're human. We all share behaviour because we're human. So if you turn that over on the other way, there's no such thing as autistic behaviour. And behaviour for me is not the issue in autism. I know it's a big deal. I know it goes on, but it's not the actual core issue. It's the end result of being autistic. And yes, we need to observe behaviour, and we need to be alert to it and aware of it, obviously, and sensitive to it. But I think we also need to throw it a bit further down the line, as it were, and think, and what is it that what's the sort of precipitation of this behaviour? It's the end result of being autistic, not the actual core definition. I mean, there is nothing in the just because being autistic, let's say autism is not, we say, how many flaps per second I can flap my hand. Autism is not how many toys I could line up to perfection in a dead straight line, although I happen to be incredibly good at that. Yeah. Autism is not how much, I don't know how well I can recite the commentary of the ice skating video word perfectly. No, it's because I have autism that I use those behaviours, and I may use them as coping strategies, or I may use them as pleasures. Well, it doesn't have to always be about it doesn't have to always be about self-stimulatory behaviour. It can also be about self-calming. So I can do things to get pleasure, I can do things to calm, I can do things to alleviate. They use these terms anxiety and stress. I think they're far too dilute. I'm going to say terror and panic. I think that's much more an appropriate description. People often talk about the anxiety that people with autism experience. No, in my case, it is, I can deal with a bit of anxiety, I can deal with a bit of apprehension and nervousness and worry, but it's terror and panic that's the beastly one.
Yes.
Roz, one of the things, and of course, me being a speech-language pathologist, this is very meaningful to me, but I've heard you say that when you get really excited, your speech bites the dust and your motor coordination soon follows.
Yes, and I can say also for it's both extreme, I'm going to say the extremes of emotion. If you imagine almost emotions having a spectrum in the way that we talk about the autism spectrum, so you've got, severe excitement, extreme excitement, and then the other end, perhaps the opposite end of that spectrum, absolute extreme terror, panic. And I think, and then you've put your all grades of everything in between. I think it's not just when I get severely overexcited that the speech and coordination, goes down. It's also when I'm terrified, and panicked. So it is both.
So what she just said reminds me of what I read in The Body Keeps the Score. One part of the left frontal lobe of the brain, called Broca's area, shuts down when confronted by trauma. Without a functioning Broca's area, you cannot put your thoughts and feelings into words. Van der Kolk writes in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. Brain scans show that when Broca's area becomes inactive, flashbacks are experienced by traumatized individuals. In other words, trauma is speechless. Traumatized people face enormous difficulty telling other people about their trauma, or to organize words to speak. When words fail to capture the experience of trauma, images of trauma take hold as nightmares or flashbacks. So that's where this area is, Broca's area.
And I think, certainly when I'm terrified, it's the self-preservation system kicks in. I go into it is withdrawal. I cut off. And also my functioning goes down. I think any human being who is in an extreme state of panic, you know, think about how that affects any human being's functioning, their reasoning, their rationalising, their mood, their temperament, and obviously behaviour again.
You weren't hit by any bullet or shrapnel. You survived multiple battles, even charges into no man's land and trench raids, and yet you're still a real casualty of war and suffer a variety of terrible physical and mental problems, for you have shell shock. In the First World War, it was as early as the first battles, such as the Mons, that military and medical authorities faced what would become a familiar feature of the war. Men with no physical injury showing real medical problems, many of which would persist long after the war. Headaches, cardiac irregularities, blindness, amnesia, depression, anxiety, loss of appetite, nightmares, and many more. By 1915, the symptoms had a name in English: shell shock. But while the name was new, it had been around for a long time, and becoming unhinged during war is as old as war itself. It's mentioned in Gilgamesh and the writings of Herodotus, and it goes under a variety of names throughout history. In the Napoleonic Wars, it was a bullet wind, when soldiers would have reactions to nearly being shot. In the American Civil War, soldier's heart was the name given to persistent cardiac problems. In more recent times, it would be called battle fatigue, Gulf War syndrome, or today, PTSD to a certain extent. What was new in World War I was the scale of it. As many as 80,000 British soldiers suffered, for example, and 100,000 Germans were treated for hysteria in field hospitals. Shell shock and its treatment would help shape the relatively new fields of neurology and psychology, and would challenge traditional ideas about madness and normality. Doctors compared symptoms they saw to those of survivors of man-made disasters, such as train wrecks, and the symptoms were often the same. There was even a name for them: railway spine. And in the 1860s and 70s, there was a series of court cases in Britain and Germany about compensating victims of railway spine. And the issues of cause and compensation would define the World War I debate about shell shock. Now, everyone agreed that the symptoms were real. But what were they caused by? Was it actual damage like micro-lesions on the brain? Or was it purely emotional or psychological? And were sufferers predisposed to it? Did they have a weak character or latent epilepsy? Well, whether physical or mental, it was generally agreed that the external cause was the force of modern artillery. Belgian Dr. Octave Laurent believed that speeding projectiles caused variations in pressure that affected the inner ear, and initially, the physical cause idea prevailed in general. Part of this was pure practicality. There was a great reluctance to accept the psychological route, since this would lead to an explosion in compensation claims. But slowly but surely, psychological explanations were accepted as well as physical, or instead. But how do you treat something so nebulous? Here's something to keep in mind, right? Back in 1884, Bismarck had passed accident insurance legislation, which compensated for medical and nervous effects of industrial accidents. Got it? Okay. Well, what this led to 30 years later was the rejection of psychological causes of shell shock in Germany for clearly stated economic reasons. It would cost the state too much money to compensate people if it was psychological. In fact, some German psychologists saw it as their job to protect the state from a proliferation of mental invalids and war pension recipients. So Germany set up a system based on containment, preventing men who might be susceptible from returning to the front and giving them work as their psychiatric treatment. These men were treated just like industrial workers. The factories and the shop floors were seen as therapeutic environments and were near treatment centers. Entire villages for the nervously ill were constructed so that under the direction of nerve doctors, men could take all sorts of jobs, and they were real paid jobs that had value, not just make work. There was no room for sympathy or pity. That was effeminate and pathogenic. In Russia, they were quite forward-thinking. And in 1916, doctors called for special hospitals and treatment centers. And then the revolution ended all that. In Britain, the psychological explanation was more readily accepted. Interestingly enough, officers were affected percentage-wise more often than enlisted men in the British Army. And some of the numbers are staggering. During the Battle of the Somme, in some areas, as high as 40% of the casualties were nervous disorders. And it apparently was contagious in some units. The Army was worried, though, that seeing it as psychological made weakness acceptable, though treatment changed when it began to be seen as a medical problem and not a disciplinary one. And by mid-1918, there was a whole network of British hospitals dedicated to shell shock. W.H.R. Rivers was a key figure for treatment of shell shock in Britain. He emphasized patients' helplessness and lack of control, and saw an interior conflict between their emotion of honest fear and their sense of duty as men, and that 3 assumptions about personal invulnerability were shattered: the world as meaningful, as comprehensible, and seeing oneself in a positive light. But long-term and post-war, shell shock created a new understanding that circumstance could cause mental breakdowns, which had nothing to do with moral fiber, and that mental illness was something that could be transient and wasn't necessarily genetic or degenerate.
And I think for autistics, this is just more pronounced. We are more sensitive to our environment, and therefore we react more quickly to stress. And this is a dysregulated nervous system.
And so my functioning will go down, and things perhaps it's certainly a safety mechanism to not necessarily even consciously, it's unconsciously withdraw from language, because that's a very it takes you're very off guard actually when you're involved in social interaction and communication, and when you're speaking it puts you in a very vulnerable position, should we say. And it's not possibly, the easiest thing for me. And so, of course, when you're terrified, you've then got to try and, offload some of those things. And when I'm excited, why on earth would I want to start getting indulging in social when I'm trying to enjoy myself? Because that certainly isn't my number one pleasure.
Right.
Yeah, Raza, I think one of the amazing things that I've learned, with the time we've spent together, for the times you came over for the conferences and are traveling together, is your self-awareness and the strategies that you do use. So after we had a tough day at a workshop with Carol, I remember we said, we were in New York City, I believe. We said, why don't we go out and eat? And you said, I don't want to do social tonight. But I mean, you have an amazing repertoire of ways to kind of prevent yourself from reaching those extreme states. I'm not saying it's been this way your whole life, but at least for the time I've known you. Do you wish to talk about that a little?
Can't get things myself. I have to be told, taught, and shown pretty much everything. And doing it, using a certain technique, should we say, has prevented some of the issues. I think also now, as an adult, I'm able. I think all adults, you have more choice in your life than perhaps when you're a child. And I've learned the hard way, I guess, to withdraw from some of the situations that are going to provoke perhaps a negative outburst from me or dangerous behaviour from me, and so on.
Now, there's a dimension of autism that's worth exploring here, and this is from clinical experience, that autism is associated with considerable stress during major transitions of life. Now, this may be leaving home, going off to university, changing jobs, a relationship ending. Change and transitions often destabilize the emotional, should we say, well-being of autistic individuals. Now, what it means is that by retiring, you now have a new structure, purpose, and identity in life, even if it's good. And often those with autism in school even transition to a preferred activity can feel very agitated at the mere transition. So although you're transitioning to a potentially what would be a good situation, your sense of structure, purpose, and identity has changed. This could be a major factor contributing to your depression.
The next category is sensory issues. Could you please describe how sensory difficulties manifest in different people? I am undiagnosed, 30 years old, and I'm exploring how common my traits are. I have this thing. When I'm triggered or super stressed or tired, or all three at once, everything becomes extremely vivid in color and super bright. The only thing that helps is lights off and a pair of sunglasses, or maybe even two. Could you also explain how common this is, and if my vividness has a specific name or term?
I don't think there is a specific name, but what I'm going to do is explore this event, which is not rare by any means. Is actually very common in autism, via the relatively new conceptualization of extraception and intraception. Now, extraception is the body's ability to perceive external, the external world, the external sensory system. Now, that can be visual, auditory, tactile, etc. What tends to occur in autism is the external sensory experiences are generally amplified. Now, that can include sensory sensitivity, not just to sound, but also the emotional state of other people. What we are increasingly identified is the complexity and interplay between anxiety and stress and sensory sensitivity. The two play together phenomenally. The more anxious and stressed you are, the more you are aware of aversive experiences in the environment. So anxiety amplifies extraception in somebody who already has high levels of extraception. Now, I saw a client the other day, and he was saying he was in Europe, wandering around, and he felt very anxious. And he thought, where's this anxiety coming from? What's happened? And then he thought, I can hear a helicopter overhead. Put headphones on, stop the noise of the helicopter, and his anxiety disappeared. So I think in this situation, it's difficult to know quite what to do, but it is a genuine and legitimate part of autism that when you have sensory sensitivity, we may not be able to change the perception. What we hope to change is the ability to tolerate and endure, or means of avoiding that sensory experience.
Appropriately, yes. It's more, the repertoire hasn't come from me, it's come from my parents, really. And also you mentioned about the sort of the vocabulary and things like that. I mean, I think that's again come from my parents' persistence and insistence as well as persistence to try and encourage me to talk.
I think the ability for anybody to understand what their boundary is and then express that boundary and then enforce it by even saying, dinner's not for me tonight, and people respect that it turns out when you share that and say, it's not for me right now. And if you're around people who can't respect that, then that's not really your tribe anyway.
I think the sad situation is that usually I've only found these where the boundaries are, my personal boundaries, as it were, is by getting it wrong, by all going. I don't actually realise. Yeah. Put it this way: I don't realise that I'm out of my depth or out of my comfort zone until my fist has hit the wall, for example, or
Yes.
I've hit hit someone or something or myself, and then I think, and then about an hour later or a day later or a week later or 6 months later, I realise, I see, that probably happened because of. But by then it's obviously too late, and I've done the really serious or dangerous thing. And so it's had to be umpteen times, every time. And I can still hear my mum saying to me, well, why did you go back there? Because I'd have a dreadful experience with somebody or in a certain situation. And my behaviour would be appalling, it would be dangerous, it could even involve, intervention. And then, of course, I would pick up the pieces, recover from it, blah, blah, blah. And then I'd go straight back there. That same thing would go wrong. And I can just hear my mum's voice saying, well, why on earth did you do that again? Or why did you go back there? And I said, well, I didn't know it would be the same again. I didn't know that. I hadn't got that insight. And I think this is the difference. I only realise that I'm overwhelmed or out of my depth when it goes wrong. It's the going wrong that tells me that it's the behaviour that tells me I haven't coped. It's nothing inside. The emotions don't trigger and say, hey, Roz, you're getting distressed here, you need to get out.
Exactly. It's
only when the fist hits the wall, as it were, that I realise, oh, yikes, I need to get up. Which is so annoying. I just think, because other people say, well, try and control yourself, try and control your behaviour, try and control your emotions, but I didn't know I was scared. I didn't know I was frightened. I didn't know I was until it's too late.
You didn't know you were that scared, and that's just it. It's sort of like telling somebody who's learning how to be a great mountain biker, well, just control yourself instead of skidding off the trail and hitting a tree. It's like, well, I didn't know that I was about to go skidding off the trail and hitting a tree. I thought the bike was riding just fine, and then I surprised myself. It's that's how you learn what your boundaries are, and but you do have to go back to the same situations, unfortunately, because life doesn't allow you to just experience something once sometimes.
And I think this is another thing. I'm very fortunate, immensely fortunate, and I'm very grateful for my parents' approach, because they didn't take the easy option, and they didn't always shield me from things that were going to be distressing and upsetting for me. My parents made me, it's not always going to go your way. You can't always have it your way. You're not always going to be happy. And I think that is one of the most beautiful lessons I've learned from my parents. You're not always going to be happy. It's not always going to revolve around you. Whereas I think a lot of parents want to say, as long as he or she's happy, that's fine by us, kind of thing. And my parents were completely saying the opposite, you're not always going to be happy. And more so, quite often, we are going to be the cause of your unhappiness. What kind of parent wants to do that? But I'm so grateful. I'm so immensely grateful, because not just the opportunities that I have now, but it's also, I just do know that with the severity of the autism that I started off with, I would, if I hadn't had that kind of tough love intervention, I would be in high levels of supported care, and then that would just be the most ghastly scenario for me, as someone who doesn't enjoy social contact, to have someone, in fact, having to need to be on the receiving end of 24-hour care would just be my biggest nightmare ever. I can have people-free time in my life now, and I'm just so grateful that my parents doing that has enabled me to have that and have the situation I have now.
With your parents kind of setting the boundaries and kind of showing you, well, Roz, you can't do that, you can do this, but also allowing you to make some mistakes. We discussed how that comes out of a trusting relationship with them, that maybe that can't happen with just anybody. And I was very taken by your comment about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think trust is huge, and people have often asked me that, again, they're looking at the social understanding aspect the whole time, and so I get asked questions like, do you love your parents? And I think my knee-jerk reaction and answer to that would be, yes, I do. But I think actually if I shred that apart, it's not necessarily a lovey-dovey sort of non-autistic or social love. It's that I trust them, and I trust them with decisions, that they make decisions on my behalf. And I trust that, like it was said, that they won't always give me the easy option. And the fact that they've given themselves a tough time to give me the opportunities now. And I also am very, very, again, the trust that's involved with, they have to knowingly, for example, put me into situations that they know will be unpleasant for me and stressful, and or overload me from a sensory point of view and things. But I get really, really nervous and anxious and worried about the use of this term autistic friendly. It's very, I think we've got to tread with a lot of caution, because it seems the loving, kind thing to make the environment as okay for the person with autism as possible, but we need to be exposed to the not so okay rather than be thrown in the deep end. So if I just use an example, perhaps the idea of perhaps keeping the lighting low level, because for somebody who doesn't like bright lights, but then what's going to happen if they suddenly find themselves in the dental surgery where you need a light, or the hospital where you're going to have fluorescent lighting, the supermarkets, a lot of the stores and so on. Or even if they want to go to pleasure things, some of they might like certain performances or shows or theatre and things, and then there might be a lot of noise, a lot of bright lights, a lot of flashing lights even, and so on. And I'm very, very grateful that my parents didn't make my upbringing autistic friendly. And I back this up with the idea that if you've got to tackle something that's really difficult or hard, challenging, frightening even, surely you'd rather tackle that in a familiar environment rather than an unfamiliar environment. So I would rather have the bright lights or the loud noises and so on in my home, in my familiar environment, than suddenly finding it when there's all sorts of other stresses and complications going on at the same time. So I think we need to use this concept of autistic friendly with caution, because the world isn't going to be autistic friendly. It's not. We can make, I would call what we call reasonable adjustments, and I think that's right for any human being. We have to be reasonable and considerate, but the world isn't going to be able to accommodate everyone. And also, I think, because of the diversity of the spectrum as well. Some people on the autism spectrum like everything really bright, and they can't manage a dim bit, and other people like it really dim and can't manage. So how, something's got to give.
Right.
Got to meet. I think this is the thing. We've got to help people with autism be able to meet halfway, rather than it all having to be revolving around them.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
You mentioned about the vocabulary and things like that. I mean, I think that's again come from my parents' persistence and insistence, as well as persistence, to try and encourage me to talk.
I think the ability for anybody to understand what their boundary is and then express that boundary and then enforce it by even saying, dinner's not for me tonight, and people respect that it turns out when you share that and say, it's not for me right now. And if you're around people who can't respect that, then that's not really your tribe anyway.
Communication is a very, very essential element of growing and belonging, for that matter. Belonging to a group, belonging to the family. And if child cannot speak, child still needs to communicate. And the body language and behavior and the facial expressions are becoming substitutes for speaking. And it's very important to understand that this is a very specific language. It can be child-specific language, and very often only parents know what it means. Folks, autistic children don't behave badly. Autistic children behave like autistic children do. Applying a yardstick to them, the same as you apply to the children that have developed normally, it's a basic error. Basic error. We are dealing with a completely different situation here.
So the need to communicate is really a very substantial need, and we cannot really develop any further if we cannot function in the society, if we cannot belong to society, belong to the family. Inability to communicate sets us apart in a way. Why is it happening? Well, because most of children that don't speak have damaged part of the frontal lobe of the brain that is called Broca area. Actually, there are two parts of brain that participate in speech: Broca's area, and Wernicke's area. And what happens is that if this area is damaged, then speech cannot be developed. It's a very, very big problem. But there is a silver lining to it, and I'm going to tell you about it. Well, you see, there are people that have damaged the Broca area and they speak. Those are people, older people particularly, or people that went through massive damage to the brain, or people that went through brain cancer, or some stroke or something like this, where Broca area has been damaged, but person retained the ability to speak. Well, why is it happening? Well, it is happening because the adjacent areas of brain took over the Broca's area function. I believe, looking at this model of older people, I personally believe very strongly that the same rule can be applied to autistic children whose Broca's area has been damaged, where forcing adjacent parts of the brain to take over the function of speech. And indeed, it works. It works. It takes a long time. It takes sometimes 2 years. But it works. And child develops speech slowly. And this is great joy when child can say mother, can say father, give me eat, I want to eat, I'm hungry, or let's go outside, something like this. Indeed, I had a situation a number of years ago when mother from England called me at 2 o'clock in the morning of all the time, you know, that's a 6-hour difference, and she forgot about it, crying to the telephone, and I was quite concerned what happened. And she said, "Doctor, you wouldn't believe it. My son came to me, took me by hand, woke me up, and told me, Mother, come to my room and play with me." The boy was 7-year-old and didn't speak a word until then. We don't know how those things really work, but I know that persistence will produce results. Restoration of the function of Broca's area is very essential. This is not really important, how well your child will be speaking, or it's going to be an accent or quite clear. What is important, that child will be able to elaborate. Child will be able to pass his or her thoughts or tell about their desires. So, just communication, belonging. Communication is belonging.